Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. Let's talk about 1998 and what was possibly the worst game released for the Super Nintendo. But 1998, what an incredible time for video games. For me personally and for the industry. I was retro gaming like crazy. I was collecting like crazy, even though I was married with young kids. It actually fit in pretty well. My kids enjoyed watching me play games. I would put them aside when it was time to do family stuff. I thought I had a pretty good balance. Plus, collecting games meant I spent time with my parents. A lot of Saturdays. With my parents? What's that all about? Garage sales. So I would get up early Saturday morning on a lot of Saturdays during the spring and summer, perhaps some of the fall too. I do remember cool fall days going to garage sales, great time. But spring, I think, is the best time for garage sales, when people are spring cleaning, getting rid of stuff, whatnot. I went to so many great garage sales in the late 90s because people were just getting rid of stuff right and left. I would go with my parents. I would go over to their house, which is about 15 minutes away from where we lived with my family. And we would go for 3 or 4 hours a lot of times. And inevitably, just about every time, I would come back with a monster load of stuff. Because in the late 90s, retro gaming, it was a thing. There were those of us who retro gamed, but it was not a mainstream thing at all. Earlier systems would be considered junk for the most part, and I could find tons of consoles and games for just, you'd come up to a box of, Atari 2600 or even like Sega Genesis or NES, a box with a console and 20 or 30 games. Just take it. 10 bucks, 20 bucks, whatever. Games for $1 a piece, consoles by themselves for $5. I got a box TurboGrafx one time for $1, just sitting in the middle of the driveway. Anyway, this was an amazing time. And gosh, just the industry itself was booming. The PS1 and the N64 were in full force. There were incredible games on the market, like Ocarina of Time, which still has, according to the reviews you'll find online, the greatest game of all time. Marvel vs. Capcom, killer fighting title. Metal Gear Solid, the stealth classic. Crash Bandicoot Warped, a personal favorite of mine. Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2.
Now, I actually reviewed Resident Evil 2 for the All Game Guide. They sent me a copy of the Nintendo 64 version. I reviewed that bad boy. Unfortunately, I had to send it back to the company, the All Game Guide, that had let me borrow that game just to review. I had to return just about every game they sent me back, but it was a fun time. Anyway, the late 90s were great. I was working for the All Game Guide, had young kids having a great time, had my wife who was, and still is, awesome, and my dad was still with us, and my mom still felt like going to garage sales. This was a long time ago. They were much younger. I was much younger. The world was a different place. My world, the world of retro gaming. Now my kids are out in the world, and it was just a much different time, and it's fun to remember that era. It was amazing. So, what else happened in 1998 that wasn't so great? The release of Frogger for the Super Nintendo. Is this the worst Super Nintendo game of all time? It just might be, based on the potential and the greatness of the Super Nintendo to port a game like Frogger. How hard could it be? After all, there's an amazing port of Mr. Do on the Super Nintendo that includes a 2-player battle mode. My favorite game of all time, as I've told you many times. Q*bert 3, they got it right. They took Q*bert and expanded it, or the system got right, I should say. They, the programmers, the developers, what have you, amazing stuff. Retro reimagined perfectly, beautifully on the Super Nintendo Q*bert 3. And it's a powerful system to begin with. To port an early 80s arcade game like Frogger to a 16-bit console that came out in 91, it would seem like an easy feat, right? But this is junk. It's a terrible translation of the arcade game for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is no music. Now, Frogger for the Super Nintendo was the last game for the console released in America, the last official original release. And man, what an amazing console with such a great legacy to have such just a flat ending. Frogger. Now, I loved Frogger in the arcades back in the day. It was an amazing, simple game, four-way control, sort of like Pac-Man, four-way control, but it was perhaps just as simple as that game, maybe a few more strategies or challenges. Maybe it was a little harder or whatever, or about the same. I don't know. I'll leave that to you guys. I was actually better at Frogger than Pac-Man, but some of you guys figured out Pac-Man, the patterns and would get really great at it. Regardless, it was a great, early, simple, four-way controls, and that was it. Great game. You're obviously hopping across a busy highway and across a river, onto logs, and into bays and all that kind of stuff. Super simple game, but very charming, very fun, with great music like Yankee Doodle and Camptown Races. Classics. Standards, favorites, and it's very catchy music, but they did not include the music in the Super Nintendo version. And these are standards. I don't believe they had to worry about securing rights to this music. These are old songs that should be in public domain, I believe. But holy cow, they also messed up the graphics on the Super Nintendo version. Now, the Super Nintendo version of Frogger has enhanced graphics, but I actually like the look of the original arcade version better. And I distinctly recall buying Frogger at Toys R Us, 1998. I'm still a hardcore retro gamer. In addition to having a PS1 and a Nintendo 64 and enjoying those consoles, I'm still getting used and having fun collecting for my older systems, including the Super Nintendo. And when Frogger came out, it seemed completely out of the blue. I hadn't heard about it, I don't believe, in magazines or anything, or any buzz on it. It was just a sort of a weird random release of a very classic arcade game. I mean, Super Nintendo has a great version of Miss Pac-Man, and there's a great version of Space Invaders with a split screen, two-player mode, but Frogger, the only thing it really had extra was enhanced graphics. Like I said, I didn't like as much as the original arcade version. And a a scoreboard, that just went away. It wasn't battery backed or anything. Just a local scoreboard where you could enter your high score, but it would go away after you turn the system off. Pretty useless. Anyway, I bought it, and there was also Frogger for the Genesis, and I could choose between the two. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Frogger in North America was the last release for the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Very late, obviously, in the life of the consoles. The last original releases. And I had a choice, Frogger for the Super Nintendo or Genesis. Now, I was a big-time collector, but I wasn't going to buy both new in the stores. I figured one day I'll maybe pick up the other one at some point later on, used at a pawn shop or something, or who knows. I was doing a lot of collecting in those days. Pawn shops, thrift stores, garage sales, you name it. And the reason I picked the Super Nintendo version was because it did appear to have superior graphics. So maybe I thought it's like Qbert 3. Maybe there's some other differences. Maybe it's like, just a better version, a more modern version, retro reimagined. But I was so disappointed with it. It controls okay. It's a solid, you can have some fun with Frogger for the Super Nintendo, but just the fact that it's so underwhelming compared to the power of the console, and it doesn't have those great songs, that takes away so much from the gameplay of Frogger. If you go to an arcade, like a modern barcade, and it's loud and you can't hear Frogger, but you play it, you might have some fun with it, but it's not as much fun without those catchy classic tunes. Very disappointing. And I didn't buy the Genesis version till later. I bought the cartridge at some point, maybe, who knows, maybe in 2003. It's my first retro gaming expo, classic gaming expo in Las Vegas. I doubt that. I probably just picked it up at a garage sale or a pawn shop or a thrift store or something, but I did end up With the Genesis version, which I did find out, I discovered that it is so much better because it is basically a drop-dead port, straight-up port of the original Frogger for the arcades, which I loved and had so much nostalgia for, because back in the early 80s and late 70s, my brother and I were big-time arcade rats. We were going to arcades all the time, especially in the early 80s. My brother could drive because he was older than me, a few years older, 5 years older, and we would go, as I've told you guys before, to the Land of Oz arcade, Aladdin's Castle, these great arcades at the mall, Malibu Grand Prix, which is basically heaven on earth at the time. I thought it was so amazing. You know, just big two-story arcade. Putt-Putt Golf had 2 stories and just was loaded down with amazing arcade games. One of these games my brother and I played and got really great at was Frogger, and my brother was even better than I was. It was amazing. If you've seen Chasing Ghosts, there's a Frogger expert in that video, can't remember his name off the top of my head, that talked about playing Frogger, and he would, you know, gently go out into the traffic and move around and take his time, and he played it very slowly and methodically and patiently. My brother is the best Frogger player I've ever seen. He played it much differently than that. He played it fast, at breakneck speed. He would just, with the joystick, just maneuvering that frog so quickly through those obstacles. It was just a wonder to behold. But I bought the Super Nintendo version because I love both the Genesis and Super Nintendo, but if I had to pick one, I would give the edge to the Super Nintendo because of games like, you know, the upgrades of Castlevania and Contra, and my favorite game, Mr. Do, and the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, Super Mario World, and on and on. Love both consoles. They are neck and neck. But I gave the edge to the Super Nintendo, and I bought the Super Nintendo version of Frogger. But obviously, I should have gotten the Sega Genesis version because it was arcade perfect and didn't have those additions that the Super Nintendo version did, and that subtraction, that major subtraction of those great folk tunes. Anyway, let me know in the comments, did you buy Frogger back in the day? Are you a Frogger fan? And what do you think the worst Super Nintendo game is? Maybe something like Family Dog? I don't know. You tell me. There's some bad games for the Super Nintendo, even though it's a monumental, amazing, great, classic system. Also tell me of your gaming experiences, your collecting experiences in the late 90s, 1998 specifically. Incredible, incredible, incredible time to be a gamer and a collector. Just phenomenal. All right, guys, thank you so much for liking. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Please hit that like button, that subscribe button, and do all that good stuff. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching this video to the end. And now a little commercial on my latest book, The 100 Greatest Console Video Games, 1988 to 1998. We will talk to you guys in another video.
It's me, Mario!